It wasn't the first time the sheriff's office had been called to the old depot, but this time it was different. As they pried open the walls of a crumbling garage years later, dust hung thick in the air, settling onto a single object, a worn bus driver's cap, its tarnished silver badge barely visible in the dim light. Beside it, a ticket punch, once gleaming, now rusted and half buried in debris. The unmistakable symbols of Robert Keller, who'd been gone for 14 years. The world he left behind hadn't been forgotten, it had simply been hidden. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. In Willow Creek, life unfolded at a pace you could set your watch to. Mornings were a slow rise, the air crisp with the kind of stillness you only find in a small town. In those early hours, you could hear the hum of the town waking up the clink of metal gates in the local shops, the chime of the school bell and the steady rhythm of Robert Keller's school bus engine as it idled near the depot. Robert was part of that soundscape, the kind of person you expected to always be there. His face, like clockwork, would appear at the window of the bus as it made its daily rounds. His cap perched above his knowing smile, a nod to each child as they stepped off. I'd seen him 100 times at that depot, the way he would laugh with the kids, always with that same sense of quiet pride. He was the kind of guy who'd stay after hours sweeping the floor or making sure every last candy wrapper had been picked up. Small acts, but they mattered. People trusted Robert not just because of his work ethic, but because he embodied something rare routine. In a world that moved fast, he was a fixture of stability. The town of Willow Creek, with its sleepy charm, was known for that same steadiness. The church bells rang at 9 a.m. sharp every Sunday. Mrs. Harris would wave at everyone on her morning walk, a familiar fixture in a worn cardigan and a wicker basket. You'd hear the sound of footsteps on the old sidewalk, the low murmur of conversations from the diner where Robert liked to stop after his shift for a quick cup of coffee with a couple of the other drivers. The rhythm was simple, familiar, predictable. But all that changed on October 4th, 1999. Robert had been doing his usual route that afternoon. Nothing out of the ordinary. The children had boarded his bus with their typical chatter, a few of them sneaking a glance at him with that same fond familiarity. I remember hearing about it later that night, how he'd been the last driver to clock out a little later than usual, but nothing that raised an eyebrow. But when I heard the news the next morning, it hit me like a wrong note in a song I'd heard 1,000 times before. Now, Robert wasn't the type to oversleep or miss a day. Sure, he was known to be a bit of a night owl, sometimes playing cards at the diner or talking shop with his fellow drivers, but missing work without a word. It wasn't like him. The dispatcher had assumed he was just running late, but when the phone calls went unanswered, the unease began to creep in. Deputies showed up at his home, knocking on the door. No answer. His car was still parked in the driveway, the door to his bungalow unlocked. But Robert was nowhere to be found. Deputy Tom Hargrove. A young man then told me later that when they first arrived at the depot, it was like stepping into a frozen scene. The bus was locked, everything in place. His thermos, still warm, sat on the dashboard. His jacket neatly folded on the seat, just like Robert had done 100 times before. His personal items, his wallet, his glasses, everything that spoke of his simple, predictable life were still in their places. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of foul play. It was as if Robert had just stepped out, but never returned. The deputies began their search around the depot. They checked every corner of that building, walked up and down the long aisles of idle buses, and listened for any sound of movement. They even brought in the dogs. But the air was still. Empty. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors stood at their doors exchanging puzzled glances as word spread. Robert wasn't just missing. Something felt wrong. For those who knew him, the idea that Robert could disappear was impossible. He was so grounded, so steady, a man of routine. It made no sense. The town had lost more than just a bus driver. They had lost a steady presence, someone who brought warmth to the ordinary. He was the kind of man who you never expected to vanish, and yet he had. But it wasn't just Robert's absence that created the unease. It was the silence that followed. No frantic phone calls, no desperate search efforts, just that deep growing sense of something left undone, something buried under the surface. His bus was still there, locked up tight. His belongings sat untouched. It was a void no one could fill. I remember standing on the porch that evening, feeling the cool air settle in. No one was talking much, but you could feel it in the tension that hung in the air. It wasn't just that Robert was gone, it was the way his absence was woven into the fabric of the town, like a piece of music that had been cut off mid-note. The usual hum of Willow Creek had gone still. And then, as the evening wore on, the one thing that should have been there, the sound of his bus rumbling past the houses, the quiet rhythm that had been there for so long, never came. The porch light stayed on longer than it should have that night. The next morning, Robert's usual knock didn't come. No bus rolled past the houses, no faint sound of children's voices drifting through the windows. That day the depot was quieter than usual, and nothing felt the same. The morning after Robert vanished, it felt like the world had changed. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, how the air feels a little too still, like something's just not right, but you can't quite put your finger on it. It was that kind of morning. It wasn't that anyone was panicked, not at first. It wasn't that dramatic. No sirens, no flashing lights. It was the small things, the empty spaces that shouldn't have been empty. The bus still parked, where it always was. The routine still going, but broken somehow. Robert was missing, and no one could quite figure out why. I wasn't there the night he vanished, of course, but I've spent enough time with the men and women who were. They all say the same thing, there wasn't a trace. The buses had been locked up tight, every single one. His thermos, still warm, sat on the dashboard. His jacket neatly folded on the driver's seat. His personal effects, everything Robert owned, were in their place, untouched. It didn't feel like someone was gone. It felt like someone had just slipped out of the picture, leaving behind nothing but their shadow. And yet, there was no explanation for it. It was as if someone had erased him. The dispatcher called, asking if anyone had seen Robert, but the usual answer came back, no. That wasn't like Robert. He'd been dependable, a man of routine. He didn't just disappear, especially not after finishing his shift like he always did. Every evening, Robert's bus was parked exactly where it should have been. Every morning, he'd be waiting at the diner, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee in hand, talking with his fellow drivers about the day's routes. It was his way of marking the end of his shift. It was comfortable. It was safe. Nothing in that town moved without him in the background. But then the silence started. It crept in unnoticed at first, then suddenly loud. Robert didn't show up for his usual route the next morning. His car was parked exactly where he had left it the night before, but there was no sign of him. The phone calls went unanswered. Deputies began to visit his usual spots, searching for any hint of where he might have gone. But they didn't find anything. No sign of struggle, no disruption in his things. Robert's house, just a short walk from the depot, was empty, but everything inside was still in place. His wallet sat untouched on the dresser, his glasses resting on the nightstand. The fridge was stocked just the basics, milk, bread, eggs, leftover stew. No indication that he planned to leave. And then there was the cap. The ticket punch. Both were missing. And that fact, more than anything else, gave everyone pause. That's what hit me the hardest when I first heard about it. Robert's cap always perched on his head, that shiny silver badge catching the light. It was more than a piece of his uniform. It was his identity, his presence. That cap and the ticket punch were who Robert was. I didn't have to know him well to understand that. He'd never go anywhere without them. Those were his tools, his marks of pride. So to find them gone, just gone, it felt wrong in a way I can't explain. Something was off, something hidden, and I didn't know yet how deep it ran. Deputy Tom Hargrove. The young man who first arrived at the depot that morning tells me now that when he stepped through the gate and saw Robert's bus just sitting there, locked and still, it hit him like a punch in the stomach. The search began immediately, of course. The dogs were brought in, the neighborhood questioned, but nothing came of it. Robert's disappearance didn't make sense. How could someone just vanish? It wasn't as if Robert was an introvert or someone prone to disappearing for no reason. He was a fixture of that town, the kind of man who loved his job and loved his routine. What struck me most was how the people who knew Robert didn't just miss him. They felt a part of themselves missing. The other bus drivers, they said it themselves, Robert wouldn't just leave. Not like this. He loved those kids, he loved that bus. He was one of the last people anyone would expect to vanish into thin air. But there it was, an empty seat, a missing person, and a whole town left to wonder what had happened. The investigators took their time, but the leads came back dry. No one could remember seeing anything unusual the night before. Some of the other drivers had seen him after his shift, but those sightings were inconsistent. One said he saw Robert walking toward the back office to drop off his clipboard, but nothing about his demeanor suggested anything was wrong. Another driver swore he'd seen Robert leaning against the fence chatting with someone in a car. But again, no license plate, no description of the vehicle, nothing solid. And so the days dragged on. Weeks passed and the search continued, but nothing turned up. By the end of the year, the sheriff's office had all but given up. They filed the case away like so many others, hoping the passage of time might shed some light. But the people of Willow Creek, they didn't forget. There was something about Robert that just didn't sit right. He was a man of routine, a man who didn't disappear. His absence gnawed at the edges of their lives. It wasn't long before the rumors began to swirl. Some thought Robert had been attacked on his walk home, assaulted by someone who knew his route. Others said he must have run into someone he trusted, someone who convinced him to get in a car and leave town. The most persistent rumor was that Robert had decided to start over, to leave his life behind and start fresh somewhere else. That theory never really sat well with anyone. After all, Robert loved his job and he loved that town. But for a long time, no one had any answers. The file grew dusty in the sheriff's office, just another case lost to time. And for a while, that was the way of it. No one really talked about Robert anymore. Some people, like Margaret Harris, the widow of another missing person from the town, still couldn't shake the memory. She'd been one of the last to see Robert that evening, standing by the fence near the depot, whispering to herself, "Not again." She wasn't the only one who felt the weight of his absence, but it was Margaret's words that stuck with me. Not again. It wasn't until years later, in the spring of 2013, that anything about Robert's disappearance would change, though I couldn't have known it at the time. I remember hearing about the garage repair project, an old brick structure near the depot that had been in need of fixing for years. The workers were chipping away at the crumbling mortar when something unexpected happened. Dust and debris poured out from behind the wall, revealing something odd, something out of place. At first, it seemed like just more old junk. But as the dust settled, the unmistakable items appeared: Robert's bus driver's cap and the corroded metal ticket punch. The realization hit me hard. The same objects that had been missing for 14 years were suddenly right there, hidden inside a wall no one thought to question. The mystery of Robert's disappearance had just deepened, and now the question was no longer if someone knew what happened. It was who and why, and the truth, when it came, would unravel everything. But for now, those items, his cap and punch, sat there like a quiet challenge, waiting for someone to finally take notice. The discovery of Robert Keller's bus driver's cap and ticket punch was a moment I'll never forget. It wasn't just that they were found after all these years. It was the way they appeared hidden in the walls of a garage that no one had thought to check. Those objects, covered in dust forgotten by time, spoke volumes more than the quiet town ever would. They seemed to whisper something darker, something that had been buried not just under brick and mortar, but deep inside the people who had lived through it all. The town. The sheriff's office. All of us, we had thought the truth was lost. But suddenly, with those two simple objects sitting there, everything felt different. Like a door had cracked open and a long-forgotten memory was starting to stir. The moment the foreman on that garage repair crew found them, everything shifted. He hadn't been expecting to unearth anything of consequence, just fixing up an old brick building that had been used for spare parts and tools. When he first struck something hollow, it was probably a relief. Maybe the wall was weaker than he thought. But then came the dust, the old stale air, the faint metallic gleam of something catching the light. At first he probably thought it was just debris, something that had been forgotten or left behind, and he would have brushed it off if it wasn't for the unmistakable shape of a bus driver's cap. There it was, the tarnished silver badge still visible, though the cap itself was stiff and almost folded into the brick, like it had been pressed into the wall and forgotten. Beside it, the ticket punch, Robert's ticket punch, corroded, worn from years of neglect, but still there. The foreman did what any person would do. He called it in. Deputies arrived, quickly strung up yellow tape, and began treating the garage like a crime scene. But by that point, a lot of us had already started to wonder what the real crime might have been. After all, those two objects hadn't just disappeared for no reason. No, they'd been hidden deliberately. That thought alone sent a shiver down my spine, something deep and unsettling, like the ground itself was whispering that something had been covered up, something that had stayed buried far longer than it should have. When the sheriff's office began to investigate, the implications were impossible to ignore. The garage wasn't far from where Robert's bus had been parked, and no one had ever thought to look there. The fact that the cap and punch had been hidden in the wall, so carefully tucked away almost intentionally, made everyone nervous. It wasn't just the objects themselves that mattered, but the way they had been placed in the wall where no one would find them. Who would do such a thing? And why? We didn't know yet how deep the mystery went, but I could feel it like a weight settling over the town. For years, Robert's disappearance had been a quiet, painful question that no one had answered. The empty space in the community where he used to be was palpable. The kids who rode his bus still remembered his voice, the soft tap of his ticket punch, as he checked them off one by one, that warm smile he gave them at the end of every day. It felt wrong to have that empty. I don't think anyone knew how much they had relied on Robert until he was gone, until the rhythm of life shifted ever so slightly. And those kids, they missed him. Parents missed him. Everyone who'd come to trust him, who'd come to know him, had that lingering sense that something wasn't right. But what were we supposed to say? There were no answers. There were no leads. Just the quiet hope that somehow someone would find him. Now, with this discovery, it was like the whole town was being forced to face something they hadn't wanted to. There had been too many years of silence, too many years of people pretending they didn't wonder what really happened. But now the sheriff's office was on high alert. They began asking questions again, revisiting everyone who had been around the depot that night, anyone who might have known something. The thing is, when you dig up the past like that, you don't always find what you're looking for. Sometimes you find things people want to stay buried. I could see it in the eyes of the people who had worked with Robert. They were nervous, unsettled, as if the past had finally come home to roost. The whispers began again. Some remembered Robert talking about a strange encounter the week before he disappeared, but no one could remember the details. Some thought he'd run into someone who meant him harm, but who others wondered if Robert had known something, seen something he shouldn't have. Maybe he'd uncovered something dark, a secret hidden in the shadows of the depot. Maybe someone had needed him to stay quiet. The more the investigation dug, the more it seemed like Robert had been swallowed up by a place he had trusted, by people he'd worked alongside for years. And the closer the sheriff's office came to finding answers, the more the past seemed to warp, turning from simple mystery into something darker. Could it be that someone Robert knew, someone he had worked with, had been the one to make him disappear? Could it be that Robert had been a victim of the very system he had served for so long? The detectives kept pressing, but the closer they got to answers, the more people seemed to slip through their fingers. The workers at the depot seemed nervous, reluctant to speak as though they knew something but weren't ready to say it. Some of the old-timers who had worked with Robert started to avoid the conversations like they were afraid of the memories. There were too many shadows in that building, too many corners where things could have been hidden away. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Robert's disappearance wasn't just a random act of violence. No, this had been planned. Someone had made sure Robert wasn't going to be found. They'd made sure those objects were hidden out of sight. And if it hadn't been for that garage repair project, who knows how much longer it would have taken before anyone knew where to look. I remember feeling that weight, that unease. The discovery of Robert's cap and ticket punch had opened something in the town, something we weren't ready for. It made everyone stop and think. What if we'd all been too trusting, too complacent? What if Robert had seen something, or worse, had been silenced for a reason we couldn't even imagine? But what was worse, and still is the way it all seemed to slip away again. The sheriff's office worked. They questioned, they followed leads. But as time passed, the fire began to fade. People tried to go back to their normal lives, but there was always that feeling, that quiet question echoing through every corner of the town. The cap and ticket punch had been returned, but Robert still wasn't home. And the truth that they symbolized, what it really meant, was still buried somewhere beneath the town in the cracks and shadows, waiting for someone to pull it into the light. The sheriff's office promised new leads, but with each passing day, the answers became harder to reach. The more they dug, the more the town grew tense. Maybe it was easier to leave the questions unanswered, to keep moving forward as if nothing had changed. But some of us couldn't let it go. There were too many pieces missing. Too many questions hanging in the air. I knew then, just like I know now, the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And so we wait. We wait for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place, but we know it might never come. The moment the cap and ticket punch were found, it was like opening a door that had been shut for years, and yet what they uncovered wasn't the relief we thought it would be. If anything, it only deepened the mystery. I remember when the news first broke about the discovery, the way the town seemed to collectively hold its breath as if waiting for something to snap into place. But when those objects came out from behind the wall, what everyone had hoped would be a breakthrough felt more like a painful reminder that we were still standing in the same place, staring at the same unanswered question. The cap and ticket punch had been hidden in that old garage wall for 14 years. That wall had held secrets. But now, in the bright daylight, those secrets were exposed, sitting there in plastic evidence bags. The sheriff's office did what they always do. They took the items in for analysis. But even the most experienced detectives couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth. This was no accident. Whoever had hidden them had done so deliberately with care. It was like they wanted Robert Keller's things out of sight, wanted them lost, erased, as if the man himself never existed. But the longer they stayed hidden, the more they seemed to haunt us. I stood in the diner later that afternoon watching the locals trickle in, their eyes glued to the television screen where the sheriff's office had just confirmed that Robert's cap and ticket punch had been found. The quiet hum of the coffee maker, the clink of mugs, all of it felt muted, distant. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had their thoughts on what it meant. But no one had answers. The questions were louder than ever. Some said it was a sick joke. Someone had taken them, hidden them away, maybe out of spite, maybe to get attention. Others said they'd been planted later, that someone who didn't want to be caught had placed them there, hoping the passage of time would bury them like it had buried Robert's disappearance. Still, there were whispers that made your skin crawl, ones that suggested someone had planned Robert's disappearance, that he'd known too much, or seen something he shouldn't have. It was one thing to lose someone without a trace. That was bad enough. But to find something so important, something so personal, buried in the walls like that, it was a betrayal. And when it became clear that no new leads would come from the discovery, I felt the weight of that betrayal press down on me. That cap and ticket punch, once symbols of a steady, reliable man, had now become the only remnants of Robert's life. The only proof that he'd ever existed in that town at all. It was a cold reminder that we had missed something somewhere along the way. A ghost of a man had been hidden for years, and the town had let it happen. The sheriff's office immediately reopened the case, of course. They had no choice. But I could tell from the look on Deputy Tom Hargrove's face that this was no longer just about finding Robert. It wasn't just about bringing someone to justice anymore. This was bigger than that. It was about the trust that had been broken, not just between the people of Willow Creek and whoever had been responsible for Robert's disappearance, but between the people and the truth itself. We had all been living with this haunting for so long, hoping it would be solved only for it to feel like we had been circling around something far worse than we had imagined. The weeks after the discovery were a blur. The sheriff's office followed leads, but the truth was, the more they dug, the more the answers seemed to slip through their fingers. Everyone they interviewed, anyone who might have known something, suddenly had a memory that was just a little too vague. There were no more solid leads, no more definitive answers. Just that unsettling feeling that the town had been sitting on this secret all along and none of us had seen it. I walked the streets of Willow Creek in those days, watching the faces of the people I'd known for years, wondering if I was looking at someone who knew more than they were saying. The depot, once a place that signified so much order and reliability, had turned into something else. It had become a symbol of our collective failure. A place where no one had thought to look for the things that had been hidden, the things that had been right in front of us all this time. The depot itself had become a place of suspicion. People started to talk in hushed voices when they passed by, as if the very air there had become tainted by the mystery that still clung to it. Every creak of the building, every shift of the old brick felt like a reminder of something unresolved. I spoke to Margaret Harris a few weeks later. Margaret had lost her own husband years before another person swallowed up by the silence of Willow Creek. I'd seen her standing at the depot, just staring at the building, her face a mask of sadness and something else, something unspoken. When I asked her what she thought about the discovery, she just shook her head, her eyes clouded. "Not again," she whispered. "Not again." She didn't need to say more. We both knew what she meant. That was the thing you see. Robert's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It wasn't just a mystery that needed solving. It was a wound in the heart of this town. And the deeper we dug, the more I realized that maybe the real question wasn't what happened to Robert. It was whether anyone in this town had been paying attention when it happened. Maybe the answer was right there, buried in the walls, but no one had seen it. The sheriff's office kept pressing, but there were too many distractions. People were nervous. They had their own lives to get back to their own routines to maintain. They couldn't keep reliving a tragedy that felt too big to fix. It's funny how the mind works sometimes. The mind wants closure, it wants answers. But when those answers start to get too close, when they start to hurt more than they heal, it's easier to ignore them. And so we did. For a time, the case settled back into its place on the shelf. The evidence sat in plastic bags, and the silence grew again. But that silence never felt the same after the cap and ticket punch were found. It was no longer a simple absence. It was a weight that we all carried, each of us in our own way. And though the sheriff's office promised they would keep working on the case, it became clear to me that the real answers might never come. Not because they couldn't be found, but because the town was too afraid of what they might uncover. And so we waited. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the disappearance of Robert Keller, but the way we had all allowed it to slip through the cracks, a secret buried so deep that even the earth had to give it back before we could see it clearly. The months that followed the discovery of Robert's cap and ticket punch were quieter than I expected. After all, when something as monumental as that is unearthed, you expect noise calls for justice, an outpouring of relief, the clamor of truths finally coming to light. But it didn't come that way. Not for us. The noise was there, sure, at first. The town felt the weight of it all. Reporters swarmed, and the sheriff's office tried to rally support for fresh leads, but beneath all that there was an undercurrent of something else: fatigue. The kind of tiredness that settles into a place after years of waiting for something, anything to break open, and then when it finally does, you're not sure you're ready to see what's inside. Robert had been gone for so long, the questions had almost started to feel like ghosts. They didn't quite haunt us anymore. They just lingered, fading into the background of daily life. We'd moved on, not because we wanted to, but because life has a way of pushing forward whether you're ready or not. Time doesn't stop for anyone, not even for someone who deserved answers. The sheriff's office reopened the case, of course. They interviewed former workers at the depot, went over old records, asked people who had been there in 1999 if they remembered anything that might now seem important. Some said they'd heard rumors at the time, but none of it was solid enough to follow. Others didn't want to speak at all, and it didn't take long for me to realize that some of them weren't just reluctant to talk, they were scared. Fear is a funny thing. It doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. It can hide behind a polite smile, behind excuses and deflections. But I saw it. I saw it in the way people began to back away from conversations about Robert. The depot, once the heartbeat of the town, became a place people avoided even if they had to pass by it every day. The worst part wasn't the fear, though. It was the silence that followed the reopening of the case. No new leads, no new suspects, no new answers. The sheriff's office combed through the evidence, analyzed the cap and ticket punch, but found nothing substantial. There were no fingerprints. The cap had worn down its fabric, crumbling from years of neglect, and the punch was too corroded to yield any useful clues. All they had was the same question: who had hidden them, and why? Eventually, even the sheriff's office slowed down. Deputies left for other cases. Investigators moved on. And the case, just like before, slipped back into the quiet shadows. There was no closure, no triumphant breakthrough. Just the same painful realization that, like Robert himself, the answers had been buried too long to uncover. As for the town, Willow Creek moved forward too, but not in the same way, not without some part of itself missing. It's strange, really. You live in a place for so long and you think you know it, you think you know the people in it. You see them every day, you say hello, you wave, you share small talk at the grocery store. But in moments like these, when a man like Robert Keller, who had been so woven into the fabric of daily life, disappears without a trace, you realize how fragile the whole thing really is. You can live next to someone for years and never truly know what they're hiding, never see the cracks in the walls until they're too big to ignore. That's what Robert's disappearance did to us. It made us aware of all the things we'd been blind to. Of the silence we'd let slip, by the questions we'd let fade, the fear we'd buried along with the truth. I saw it in the eyes of the people who had worked with Robert, who had known him so well. It was like they were still waiting for something to happen, for the truth to finally surface. But it never did. It just stayed in the corners, in the shadows, just out of reach. It's funny how that works, isn't it? How a town can be full of life, full of movement, but still be haunted by one missing person, one unspoken truth. I think that's the hardest part of all this. The truth didn't just disappear with Robert. It got buried. And even though we've moved on, even though we've tried to live our lives, the weight of what was left behind still lingers. You can hear it in the quiet moments, in the small things that remind you of him. The tap of a ticket punch, the sound of a bus door opening, the way the wind sounds when it brushes past the depot. These are the things that keep him alive in a way, but they also serve as reminders of what we lost and what we'll never know. Some people have asked me what the case taught me, what I learned from it all. Maybe it's this: we all have a part to play in the stories of the people around us, even if we don't realize it at the time. It's easy to go on with life, to get caught up in your own routine, your own struggles. But in the end, the most important thing is remembering the people who are no longer with us, the things they leave behind, the small pieces of themselves that make up the bigger picture. Robert Keller may not have been a hero. He may not have been anyone's savior. But he mattered. He mattered to the kids who rode his bus every day, to the parents who saw him as a steady hand in their lives. He mattered to me, even though I wasn't close to him, because he was part of the rhythm of that town. And when he was gone, it was like the whole town skipped a beat. That's the cost of disappearing, I think. It's not just the person who's lost. It's everyone who's left behind, trying to make sense of the silence. So here we are, still wondering what happened, still waiting for answers that may never come. But I'll keep the memory of Robert Keller alive, not just as a reminder of a case unsolved, but as a testament to the people who shaped this town, who left their marks in ways we may never fully understand. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.